And our next speaker is going to be Nina Lager Vestberg, and we'll just need a moment to set up the different technology.
So I'd like to thank you, the organizers, for obviously the invitation to be here. And it's not loud enough now. Shall I shout? Maybe there's something with the angle. Shall I lean back? What's wrong? Okay, I'll make my excuses then when nobody can really hear. I'd just like to say something that people often say, that what I'm about to present is a work in progress. And I really mean it this time. I'm writing a book at the moment. I'm trying to finish it, which is about photographic archives in the transition from analog to digital. And what I'm presenting now is a kind of very rough draft of one of the chapters. So I'm really hoping, actually, that I'll be able to get some feedback from you about where to take this material further, because it's really not quite formed yet. And it's pretty much, as you'll see, stuck in at the analog stage. Okay. Early on in David Lodge's novel, Nice Work, that was published in 1988, there is a description of one of the protagonists, the feminist literary critic, Dr. Robin Penrose, having sex with her partner, Charles, who's also a literary scholar. In fact, he's a specialist in romantic poetry, which of course is a good qualification for a lover. The reader is told that Charles's techniques of foreplay are so meticulous as to cause his lover on occasion to nod off, only to, and I quote, wake with a guilty start to find him still crouched studiously over her body, fingering it like a box of index cards. Now, this image of the academic, who makes love much in the same way as he conducts research, is funny, of course, because it suggests that scholars of literature are prone to confound bodies with texts, pleasure with work, and lived experience with library study. And all of that may, of course, be absolutely valid observations. In the present context, however, I'm invoking this image of Charles rifling through Robin's body because it also throws up other more subtle connotations, such as the physical aspects of archival research itself, the fingering, as it were, of actual index cards, the archival object as a sensitive, even a sensual being, and the body as an archive of its own. These three aspects each relate, in various ways, to conceptions of the material, spatial, and sensual properties of the archive, which I want to explore in this paper. I'll focus my presentation on 2 or 3, depending on how you count, audiovisual and literary representations of the archive, which both, to my mind, may be read as both mediations of and meditations on the material significance of archives in culture. The first of these is A.S. Byatt's novel Possession, a Romance, from 1990, which was subsequently adapted for the screen in 2002. And the second is Stephen Polyakov's play for television, Shooting the Past, which was first screened on BBC in 1999. And actually, on the right here, the image is in fact at the cover of the screenplay, published screenplay of Shooting the Past. So, in fact, both these works exist in filmed and published versions. So I'll start with Possession. And this is a quote. "The book was thick and black and covered with dust. Its boards were bowed and creaking. It had been maltreated in its own time. Its spine was missing, or rather protruded from amongst the leaves like a bulky marker. It was bandaged about and about with dirty white tape, tied in a neat bow. The librarian handed it to Roland Mitchell, who was sitting waiting for it in the reading room of the London Library. It had been exhumed from locked safe number 5, where it usually stood between Pranks of Priapus and the Grecian Way of Love. It was 10 in the morning, one day, in September 1986. Now, there are 3 kinds of salient information relayed in this excerpt. First, a description of the archival object as a fragile physical thing, maltreated, bandaged, covered with dust. And second, an exact location for the retrieval of the object, locked safe number 5 at the London Library. And third, the time and place where this consultation took place, one day in September 1986, in the reading room of the aforementioned library. Description, date, and location are, of course, the elementary features of any inventory or catalogue entry. And so what Byatt provides in these opening sentences is, among other things, a means by which the reader may immediately enter into the archival mindset of the novel. Possession is a novel entirely predicated on the material, sensual, and spatial properties of the archive. Reading this book 20 years on from its initial publication, one is struck by how the story is completely circumscribed by the precise technological configurations of its day, its temporality, we might say. To the near-contemporary reader of 1990, the information that the scene takes place one day in September 1986 may have been a perfectly innocuous detail, but within less than a decade, it would have become a crucial marker of the novel's periodicity. True enough, Byatt's tale of literary pursuit across the centuries could possibly have been set 1 or 2 decades earlier, in the late 1960s or early 1970s perhaps. Yet within 10 years of its publication, the discoveries and adventures of the novel's protagonists, literary scholars Roland Mitchell and Maud Bailey, could not have taken place, or could not have taken place in the same way. For by the late 1990s, the modes of communication upon which the plausibility of the plot relies had become outdated. Email had superseded letter writing, digital image files had replaced the microfiche, computer cataloging had made index cards redundant, and not least, mobile phones had all but chased the humble phone booth off the London streets. Virtually all the narrative turning points in Possession happen in or due to the pockets of time that in a pre-digital age tended to buffer the moments of sending or leaving messages and receiving or responding to them. As Jacques Derrida writes of the correspondence that makes up a significant part of the archives of psychoanalysis, and I quote, "A handwritten letter takes so many days to arrive in another European city, and nothing is ever independent of this delay. Everything remains on its scale." End of quote. This dependency of the Possession plot on its historical technological present becomes almost painfully clear when viewing the film adaptation of the novel that filmmaker Neil LaBute made more than 10 years later in 2002. And I will try to show it. Help, help. All wrong.
Okay, should I play it here? I found something today I think is pretty incredible. I shan't forget the first glimpse of your form. I have dreamt nightly of your face.
I cannot let you burn me up.
What happened?
It's playing the next one.
Oh. Oh, you didn't get to see the whole thing? And now I worry that we don't have proper... Okay.
We have only 30 seconds of it.
Oops.
Yes.
Okay, well, fine. You get the idea.
Sorry? Yeah.
Okay then, choosing to set the action in the near present of the film shoot, various details of the mise en scène suggest that it's set in the year 2000. LaBute had a hard time reconciling the analog plot with the technological realities of its digital diegetic moment. Now the film just about gets away with neither Roland nor Maud owning a mobile phone in 2000. They are, after all, dusty academics, many of whom did lag behind in the acquisition of such luxuries. But the character's reliance on the fax machine over email for international communication, for example, would have jarred with most contemporary viewers even 9 years ago. Yet such discrepancies are necessary in order for the plot to make any sense whatsoever. And what is more, the literary mystery that the protagonists resolve in the course of the plot is itself uncovered thanks to the technical peculiarities of an even earlier culture of communication, the pre-telegraphic era of the 1860s. When virtually all messaging was conducted by letters in ink on paper, the people composing those messages were prone to leaving accidental archival evidence in the form of drafts. And it's one such draft letter, from the male poet Randolph Henry Ashe to the female poet Christabel Lamotte, discovered by Roland between the pages of the book that he goes to look at in the London Library. This is what sparks off the archival quest that forms the central plot of the novel and subsequently of the film. And I'll see if we've got enough to show you how he actually stealing the letters. Is it going to play? Here we are.
Dear Madam, since our pleasant conversation, I have thought of little else.
Uh-oh.
Hetty, your grandmother, travelled from great house to great house with the Minotaur Orchestra. But there was something about this.
Oh! So do I press on that? Okay. So yeah, leave that one. Sorry. You were going to see a much longer clip, which also showed how he very surreptitiously managed to steal these letters. But you did see the letters and how he found them in the book. So you may just have to put yourself through seeing this film, which is not all that recommended. But anyway. What the film tries to convey, and what you would have seen if I'd managed to show the clip properly, through acting and the dramatic background music, is actually spelt out much better in the novel, and much more clearly. Because Roland feels compelled to steal the draft letters that he finds because, and I quote, "it was suddenly quite impossible to put these living words back into page 300 of Vico and returning them to safe number 5. Now, a little later on, when Roland has followed up on some of the clues discernible in the letters through more conventional archival sources, Roland is put in touch with Maud, who is an expert on Christabel Lamotte, in the same way that he is an Ashe specialist. And after confessing to Maud how he came by the letters, Roland tries to justify his theft by explaining his sense of them as being alive. A notion initially discredited by Maud, until a few pages later she gets to see the hand-drafted originals and concludes, "I see," she said, "they are alive." Together, Roland and Maud discover the hoard of correspondence which constitutes the chief archival find of the story. The collection of letters is found thanks to Maud's intimate knowledge of Lamotte's poetry, which primes her memory to recall precisely the relevant verse which contains the clue to the hiding place, a secret compartment inside a doll's bed. When she and Roland happened to be allowed inside the decrepit old country house where Lamotte had spent her last years. Now, in fact, few of the truly valuable documents in possession are found neatly filed and indexed in boxes or filing cabinets, although these central work tools of the analog archive are much consulted by its characters in the course of the narrative. The draft letter, which triggers the quest, is found and stolen from inside a book. The love letters have been kept in the aforementioned doll's bed, while the final clues, which include both a letter, a photograph, and a lock of hair, are retrieved morbidly from the grave of Randolph Henry Ashe. Together, these rather unorthodoxically archived objects reveal, moreover, that Maud herself is descended from both Lamotte and Ashe, being the great-great-great-granddaughter of their illegitimate child. Gazing together with Roland at the photograph of her great-great-great-grandmother, Maud says, "She looks like Christabel," at which Roland replies, "She looks like you." And I quote, he added, "She looks like Randolph Ashe too, the width of the brow, the width of the mouth, the end of the eyebrows, there. So I look like Randolph Henry Ashe. Roland touched her face. I would never have seen it, but yes. Maud's body, then, constitutes an archive of its own, a genetic repository of physical attributes handed down, as it were, from Ashe and Lamotte. And in the final stages of the novel, Roland gains privileged access even to this archive, as he finally takes possession of Maud's body. Yet this takes place only after, and I quote, the infinite gentle delays and delicate diversions and variations of indirect assault, end of quote, which reveal him too as a scholarly lover, as studious in bed as he has proved himself in the archive. Now, you may have been forgiven for wondering up to this point in my presentation when the photographic archive might get a mention, and it will now. Once again, the archive in question will be a fictional one, invented for the purpose of another story which tells of possessions in, of, and by the archive. I have elsewhere discussed Stephen Polyakov's play for television, Shooting the Past, as an evocative representation of the photographic archive as a physical haptic space, viewing it as a compelling representation of what I call the archive from within, which illustrates in particular the spatial character of memory as it is deployed in the photographic librarians, or by the photographic librarians in the retrieval of images from the analog archive. In my previous writing on this work, I focused primarily on its representation of the archive as a secluded environment. Yet in this paper, I want to emphasize its staging of the photo library as a place of seduction, which is, of course, another one of those classic tropes of the archive. Now, Shooting the Past tells the story of the Fallon Picture Library and Collection, located in a beautiful house on the outskirts of London. And it's a collection that faces closure after it's been bought by a businessman from the US. The businessman, Anderson, played by Liam Cunningham, has only acquired the collection because it came as a job lot together with the large and impressive building that houses it. When he realizes that the managers and employees of the collection have failed to sell off its assets in preparation for the repurposing of the building as a business school, he is both shocked and angry, threatening to destroy the entire collection. The employees must therefore try to save the collection somehow, ideally by coming up with a compelling reason for Anderson to want to hang on to all of the photographs, and not just a few famous and valuable ones. The main protagonists are, as in Possession, a man and a woman. Well, this is the man, Oswald, played by Timothy Spall. And here they are together, Oswald and Marilyn. So they are a man and a woman. They're not romantically involved, and they won't be in the course of the narrative either. Oswald is very much the anti-hero, a crabby and disheveled figure who is in fact partly to blame for the circumstances in which he and his colleagues find themselves. And his chief tactic is to try and scare off the new owner by acting like a delusional madman, all the while secretly mining the collection for material that might produce an argument against its dispersal or destruction. Lindsay Duncan's character, Marilyn, on the left, is a rather more glamorous figure, as her first name suggests, of course. And as the general manager of the collection, her immediate strategy is to mobilize the seductive powers of the archive, and to some extent, those of herself. There is some suggestion that the combination of Marilyn and the picture library has been a potent one in the past. There's a short flashback sequence where Oswald teases her about a Norwegian walrus researcher with whom she appears to have been getting intimate amongst the print boxes and the filing cabinets. Now, the librarian's first attempt at persuading Anderson to hang on to the collection is to simply try and overwhelm him with the wealth and range of images contained within the 10 million strong picture collection. When this fails, they try to move him more directly by presenting the story in photographs of Lily, a young Jewish girl growing up in Berlin in the 1930s, whose life story emblematizes the horror of the Holocaust and the role of photographs in preserving the memory of its victims as well as its survivors. Finally, Oswald and Marilyn succeed when, through their collective efforts, they're able to trace and tell the extraordinary story of Andersen's maternal grandmother, as it happens to be documented in the photographs scattered throughout the collection. The images which tell the story, and tell is in scare quotes there, have only been assembled thanks to the picture librarian's exceptional powers of visual and verbal association. Now, the clip I've chosen to demonstrate the effect that this story has on Andersen is taken from the final part of the drama, when he's confronted with images showing his grandmother as a young and, shall we say, adventurous woman. And I'm hoping that you'll get to see at least some of this now. It should have been a clip of 5 minutes. It looks like we may just have 30 seconds. But at least we'll stick to time in that case.
Hetty, your grandmother, travelled from great house to great house with the Minotaur Orchestra. But there was something about this band. Behind closed doors, they held their own wilder parties.
Okay. I'll just have to be kind of titillate you with these small snippets. Why does it keep doing that? Yeah. I thought. Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, I'll just try and explain to you. I don't know if you could even see it very clearly on this screen how the whole the mise en scène is pretty much full of photographs hanging everywhere, and so Andersen gets to see these really rather saucy pictures of his own grandmother in the kind of Edwardian period, so early in the 20th century, and kind of proto-surrealist type photographs of women with strange objects and not very many clothes on, etc. And one of the main effects of this is that there's piles and piles of photographs, like, you know, of paper, archival photographs with lots of stuff written on the back of them, etc., etc. And at the end, you can see that Andersen is actually getting quite turned on by these pictures of his own grandmother as a young woman, which is quite interesting. And he sort of comments that they're weird and sensual, these pictures. In the sequence, there's in fact a very complex layering of archival material and archival modes. Because, of course, on the surface, it's simply a selection of old photographs that he's looking through. But any observant spectator will realize that the photographs are not real old photographs. They're new photographs produced either from old ones or to look like old ones. So that for all that shooting the past is a play about, among other things, the truth and magic residing in photographic prints on paper, the digital imaging application Photoshop was heavily deployed in the recreation of these apparently analog documents. And the figure of Hetty, which we get to see in several pictures, was in fact played by a model, and her image was, in some cases, photoshopped into the old news photographs, and in other cases, such as these kind of saucy surrealistic images that I mentioned, the photographs were shot especially to be used as stills in the drama and then artificially aged to look like vintage prints. So the production design just threw anything at them to make them look kind of old and yellowed. In addition to the people, places, and events, of course, that are recorded in these diegetic documents, as it were, another archival layer occurs at the level of the film itself, as the moving camera records the still photographs. In the DVD commentary to this play, Polyakov professes a fascination for what happens when a film camera looks at a photograph. And in the sequence we just seen, if we'd seen the whole of it, This fascination is embodied in Anderson's increasingly evident appetite for the pictures of his grandmother as a young woman. And this is manifested not just in close-up of his face, but also in the way his hands repeatedly touch and almost caress the surface of the photographic prints. And so Anderson, mildly aroused by the sight and touch of these weird, sensual pictures of his grandmother, thus stands for the film medium's Oedipal attraction to its own ancestor, photography. The final photograph in the story, which ultimately does persuade Anderson that the Hetty in Marilyn's story is in fact the same Hetty as is his grandmother, is a picture which also features himself as a child sitting on his mother's lap. And the presence then of these three figures in the same frame is significant because the entire story of Hetty has been assembled on the basis of one single photograph, the picture of Anderson's mother, which he carries in his wallet, his pocket full of memory, and which he at one point earlier on in the drama has been persuaded to show Oswald. We remember how at the end of the novel Possession, Roland finds the features of Ashe and Lamotte archived in the portrait photograph of Maud's great-great-great-grandmother, and the same features preserved in the living archive of Maud's own face. In Shooting the Past, Oswald has performed a visual tracing in the opposite direction, from the archived features of Anderson's mother in the photograph to the very similar features of a face he already knew from pictures in the collection. In the photograph of Anderson, his mother and his grandmother in the same place, this link is confirmed, as the only remaining real-life referent of the photograph is confronted with his own past image. Now, I said at the outset of this presentation that the two works I've been looking at, Possession and Shooting the Past, both function simultaneously as meditations of and meditations on the archive. In the case of Shooting the Past, I've also pointed to ways in which the medium of film, to some extent, archives the medium of photography. And in my concluding remarks, I'd like to consider the significance of the relationship between the medium of archiving and the medium that is being archived. I've already commented on how the filmmaker's choice to relocate the Possession story in time from 1986 to 2000 puts a terrible strain on the plausibility of the plot in the film adaptation of the novel, since most of the key turning points in the action are dependent upon the delay that was built into pre-digital modes of communication. Yet what this bad adaptation demonstrates rather well, although I'm sure it's not intentional, is the unsuitability, in fact, of the moving image as a format in which to mediate texts. The novel Possession is, among other things, an invented archive of texts. The codex volume incorporates poems, essays, fairy tales, diaries, and letters, to name but the most frequently occurring genres in which the story unfolds. In a film where these texts must either be spoken or heard as dialogue, or shown/seen as visual artifacts, I would argue that the medium of text is depleted. The content of the textual documents is elided, and their quiddity as texts is reduced to either mere interpretation, as spoken words, or mere substrate, faded paper. The hermeneutic pleasures of reading disappear, and along with them, the pleasure, indeed, the point of the whole work. Shooting the Past, as I've already suggested, is also an archive in itself, in addition to being a representation of an archive. Compared to the screen adaptation of Possession, however, the moving audiovisuality of Shooting the Past does not detract from the still photographs that are its chief archival objects. The film medium is not only able to reproduce photographs in a way which allows spectators to read the content of the images themselves through movement and sound, it is also able to produce interpretations of that content as well as represent the haptic qualities of the paper substrate. In particular, I would say that the use of movement and sound in Shooting the Past draws attention to the tactile surface and audible materiality of vintage paper prints. In this way, the televisual play succeeds in making the photographic documents it contains into something more than the sum of content, substrate, and an interpretation. as a dynamic archive of photography, it produces a surplus rather than a deficit of potential meaning. And it opens up rather than closing off a space for spectators to take their own pleasure in the sensual and multisensory properties of the medium. And I would say that the same goes for the literary archive that is the novel Possession, which in its complex textual play of genre and pastiche, together with the richness of description, allows the reader to envisage images that will prove impossible to reproduce outside the text, as it were. Finally, both Possession and Shooting the Past arrive at bringing the archive to life. First and foremost, by establishing direct indexical connections between dead archival documents and living human beings. Maud is related to Christabel Lamotte, yet Christabel Lamotte is no longer anything but a collection of texts, in the same way that Andersen's grandmother only exists in a selection of photographs. Most compellingly, however, in both works, the archive comes alive at the moment when the characters manage to make what Lynn Wells calls an imaginative connection with the past, finding in its surviving historical documents a means by which to enrich and ultimately enliven their own terms of existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, for that telling reminder of the physical and sensual aspects of the archive and the relationship of desire and pleasure that it actually excites. And I'm sorry no amount of stroking and caressing of the PC could make it do what you wanted it to do. But that means we have time for questions, and I'm looking first at the back so that the tyranny of the front rows could be moderated. But no.
Thank you. I was wondering if your research would allow us to say a few more general things about, more generally, the relationship between the novel and the archive. I mean, it's not by coincidence that the rise of the modern archive coincides, more or less, with the rise of the modern novel. And it's not by coincidence also that so many novels, much earlier than the ones that you have discussed, include documents and all kinds of administrative material. So I'm curious how these novels, which are much more recent than that, represent sort of permutations on, or variations on the kind of genealogical affinity between archives and novels more generally.
I think you're absolutely right, and it's not something I've thought about consciously, but I will now take it very much into account, because I think it's also, I mean, Possession obviously has so many layers, it's impossible to kind of explain, even begin to kind of summarize them, but precisely the fact that it's a novel set set round about the time that the whole archival turn happens in scholarship as well, and then looks back to the 1860s and literary culture then, which of course is also a sort of high point in the realist novel. I think there's probably a lot to be done there. So thank you for that comment. I couldn't really elaborate, but I'll be looking into it. It's very helpful. Thanks.
It's interesting that the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas actually claims in its promotional material to have been the site of Possession, the model for it, so that the archive itself uses it in its own self-promotion.
Thank you. I have the mic already. Nina, thank you for this very exciting presentation. It seems to me that there is an irreducible component in your talk, and that is the seduction of the cinematic image. And I would add to this that when a photograph is shown in a movie, well, it seems to me that the phenomenology of the photograph would be transformed, because the phenomenology of the photograph or of a photograph is not the same as that of a moving picture. So something happens to a photograph in a film. Although we know of films that consist of shots such as La Jetée, but those are very rare examples, striking examples of films made of photographs. So I'm just thinking on this intermingling of media you know, but to say nothing of literature, of course. So I would be interested in knowing if you would really like to expand on those issues. Thank you.
Well, I don't know how much more I can say about it, but because you pretty much summarise it. But you're absolutely right, and this is you use exactly the same words that Stephen Polikoff uses in his commentary to the DVD. He says, when a film camera looks at a photograph, something happens, and he's very fascinated by that thing that happens. And I think to a certain extent, and he also in his commentary links it to this precise scene that I was trying to show when Anderson is looking at these pictures of his own grandmother and the kind of ancestral relationship, and that he's clearly being kind of turned on by his old relative, which is a bit, weird in itself. But that is an allegory, if you like, of how cinema looks at a photograph. That there's something very exciting and seductive about the still photograph, which has something to do with a kind of genealogical relationship or something. But I think there's a lot, well, you might even say media archaeologically to be unpicked in that scene and in the whole of shooting the past, which I will be attending to further. Thanks.
No more questions.
In the very end, you used one of the metaphors which we all use a lot, the dead archive, and then it becomes alive. Couldn't it be that we are still anthropomorphizing the archive? The archive is not about life or death or something. I mean, at the moment the archive becomes alive, and I think the next project of the photographic, of the Archaeology of Photography Foundation is the living archive and things like that. In a way, we are still anthropomorphizing the archive, and maybe it might be a helpful strategy to say that the question of life and death and organisms and human processing of data and memory and things like that is one thing, and the archive as a state, as an aggregation or whatever how we call it, is a different thing. It's not about life and death at all.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point, and I often have this problem when I give presentations that when I speak, I'm usually quite ironic and sarcastic all the time, and most of what I say is in quotation marks, and it's difficult to convey that. So when I use metaphors like that, for me, the quotation marks are there, and I know that you can say that they are recurring tropes, or they are cliches, or they are, well, whatever you like, really. But I think that doesn't mean that they're not valid in the sense that, or that they're not current in, in discourse, and that it. And for example, that works of literature or television or film might make use of them. And so when analysing those works, one needs to pay attention to that. And that's what I was doing. But no, absolutely important to be critical of that move of anthropomorphizing the stuff that is the archive.
Well, let us thank Nina very much.